1.5 degrees within reach. Of course, the UK, like any other country, needs to see what more we can do. But I would just say, I hope she will acknowledge that we are seen as a leader in the world. And indeed, since 2000, as I said, we've decarbonised our economy faster than any other G20 nation.
Number 11, please, Mr. Speaker.
Climate change and biodiversity loss are inextricably linked. That's why the UK has made nature a core priority of our COP26 presidency. We pioneered and launched the Leaders' Pledge for Nature in September last year, and we are also driving global action to protect and restore critical ecosystems like forests and accelerating a transition towards sustainable agriculture, whilst mobilising the finance to support this.
Speaker, in order to tackle biodiversity loss, the Convention on Biological Diversity, COP15 in May, will support new targets on nature. However, with the environmental bill delayed yet again, how will the Minister ensure that the outcomes from this conference will feed into the COP26 in November this year?
The Prime Minister and President Xi have agreed that the UK and China should work together as respective hosts of the UNFCCC COP26 and CBD COP15 to reinforce and amplify those linkages between climate change and biodiversity loss and to achieve mutually supportive and ambitious outcomes at both summits. So we're working closely with our Chinese counterparts and with the UN Secretariats of the UNFCCC, the CBD and the CCD conventions to strengthen those links between these conventions to deliver the best outcomes for nature.
Virginia Crosby.
Question 12, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I have so far engaged with ministers and negotiators from over 80 countries and briefed all parties through the UN on a number of occasions. This, of course, includes discussions with representatives of countries including China, the US, the EU and India.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I thank the Secretary of State for his answer. In light of Germany's Coal Phase-Out Act, which states it will not end the use of coal-powered energy until 2038, how does the Minister intend to use COP26 to promote nuclear power, in particular at key UK sites like Wilvernerith on Anglesey, in order to meet the UK's net zero targets?
President.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is of course a consistent and strong champion of both the nuclear sector and the Wilfer site in her constituency, and of course I commend her zeal. But as I've said to her previously, nuclear power is clearly has a role to play in our clean energy mix as we work towards net zero emissions by 2050, and she will know in the 10-point plan the Prime Minister set out, we are backing large nuclear as well as SMRs and AMRs.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I have engaged with hundreds of global and UK businesses through a combination of speaking at high-profile events and bilateral meetings, as well as through my COP26 Business Leaders Advisory Group. Businesses have a key role to play in tackling climate change, and I encourage them all to sign up to the Race to Zero campaign.
Well, Fletcher.
For that answer. Derbyshire County Council recently launched a £2 million Green Entrepreneurs Fund for businesses that are interested in green energy and carbon reduction. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that this is an excellent example of local government and businesses working together, and will he share my praise for the County Council leader, Barry Lewis, for his visionary leadership on this issue?
Speaker, I commend both my honourable friend and, of course, the leader of Derbyshire County Council, Barry Lewis, for championing this excellent initiative. And this is precisely the type of scheme we want to see, supporting businesses, supporting growth and jobs whilst cutting emissions.
David Johnson.
Question 14, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will answer questions 14, 15 and 16 together. I want COP26 to be the most inclusive ever, and the voices of young people are vital to this process. That is why I've set up an international COP26 Civil Society and Youth Advisory Council, allowing for a regular dialogue with youth activists, NGOs, Indigenous peoples and faith groups as we plan for COP26.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a pile of letters on my desk from children at Gems Didcot and John Blandy primary schools who've written to me to tell me what they've learnt about climate change, what positive changes they saw in the environment during lockdown, and to give me their ideas of things they think the government should be doing. Can my right honourable friend tell me how children and young people will be able to feed into the preparations for COP26?
President.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for championing the views of young people in his constituency, and of course I pay tribute to the pupils at John Blandy and James Didcot primary schools for their enthusiasm for climate action. I'll be delighted to receive their letters, review their ideas, and through him I will respond in writing to his constituents.
Let's go to Laura Farris. Laura.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend and I both have the privilege of representing seats in Berkshire, where many young people are passionate about climate change and are active in local groups like the West Berkshire Climate Action Network. This is their first real opportunity to see UK leadership in action. Could my right honourable friend confirm to me how they can access the Youth Council that he just described and other mechanisms to feed their ideas into the COP later this year?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for the work that she also does in promoting climate action. I'd be very happy to hear from young people and youth groups in her constituency. What I can tell her, though, is that we will be engaging further with schools in relation to COP26 to unleash the enthusiasm and energy of young people across the UK to tackle climate change.
Susan Webb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all have a stake in protecting our climate, particularly young adults in my constituency, who I hope will be the pioneers of change. As part of the UK-Italy COP26 partnership, what are the plans for the Youth for Climate 2021 Driving Ambition event to be held in Milan in September?
Mr. Speaker, from the 28th to the 30th September, the Youth for Climate event will bring together 400 youth delegates from across the globe to discuss topics under a range of thematic areas, and the event will culminate in a declaration and discussion between the youth delegates and ministers attending the pre-COP26 event.
We now come to topicals for the COP President.
Mr. Speaker, if we are to protect our planet from the ravages of climate change, we must support developing countries to respond. But without adequate finance, the task ahead is well nigh impossible. That is why on the 31st of March, the UK presidency convened around 50 developing and donor countries and multilateral institutions to consider how we can get more and more timely public finance flowing to climate action. I'm very pleased that we've secured a range of commitments from the likes of the World Bank, the IMF and donor countries to move this vital work forward. It is our moral duty, Mr. Speaker, to protect the most vulnerable communities from a climate crisis that they have not caused.
Let's go to Debbie Abrahams. Debbie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, how does supporting a new Cumbrian coal mine, giving new licences for oil and gas exploration, scrapping the Greenhouse Homes grant and reducing incentives for electric vehicles reflect the government's stated commitment to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050? Or is this more dad-dancing rhetoric by the Prime Minister, unconvincing and uncoordinated?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady raised a number of points. I think in previous answers I have set out the ambition that the UK has and the progress that we've made, but specifically when it comes to oil and gas licensing, the UK government is going to be introducing a new climate compatibility checkpoint before each future oil and gas licensing round to ensure that licences awarded are aligned with wider climate objectives, including net zero emissions by 2050.
Go to Shirley McCauley. Shirley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Surfers Against Sewage in my constituency are ardent environmental campaigners, particularly on plastic pollution and water quality, and our environment is all the better for their work. The government has a key role to play on protecting the environment. So can my right honourable friend assure me that when the world gathers for COP26 in November, protecting and enhancing the environment, particularly for the people of Cornwall, is at the very top of their agenda?
Mr. Speaker, the COP26 Nature Campaign is driving ambitious international and domestic action to protect and enhance our environment, and this will be a high priority at COP26 in November. I commend the work that Surfers Against Sewage are doing on water pollution and water quality, which I hope to see firsthand when I visit Cornwall as part of the G7 summit in June. Protecting the ocean, including through nature-based solutions, provides multiple vitally important climate change adaptation and resilience benefits.
Secretary Edmund.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month, the COP president wrote that the world is, and I quote, doing nowhere near enough to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, and he's right. Now, a green economic stimulus could make a huge difference to meeting the target. But while we have put it as the top item on the G7 agenda, the sum total of the Chancellor's measures here in the UK promised just 12 billion of green spending over a decade, and he's already cut £1 billion from that. Our investment is 60 times smaller than President Biden's green infrastructure plan. Isn't it a very significant challenge for COP26 that when it comes to a green stimulus, we're telling others to act, but not doing so ourselves.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman knows that we agree on many of these issues in terms of tackling climate change. But what I would say to him is that when it comes to government money, what we've also done is ensured that we leverage in private sector money. This isn't just about government money, it is also leveraging private sector money. And ultimately, this is about not just cutting emissions, but also creating jobs for constituents across the UK.
He will know, as COP26 hosts, our actions face particular scrutiny, and I think he will know the international community is increasingly concerned, and not just on green recovery. The government calls on others to power past coal, but flirts with a new coal mine. It says to others adopt a net zero target, but is off track on ours. And it tells countries to support the world's poorest, but slashes aid spending. Rachel Kite, former Special Representative of the UN Secretary General, said this week about our record on climate, what the UK is doing is like dad dancing. They are very uncoordinated. Isn't it time the government gave up the dad dancing on climate and showed some consistent leadership?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know he himself is obviously a very good dancer and therefore is unlikely to take part in dad dancing. We should try it together at some point. Can I just say to him? Can I just say to him that, of course, every country, including the UK, needs to make more progress in terms of cutting emissions. He makes specific reference to coal. He will know that our energy mix when it comes to coal has gone from 40% in 2012 to less than 2% last year. And we have been leading the Powering Past Coal Alliance, where a large number of countries have now signed up. So we are making progress. Of course, there is more that we can do.
We now come to Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend tell the House what diplomatic steps he has taken to engage with international partners on preparation for COP26?
Mr. Speaker, we're working closely at many levels with international partners on preparations for COP26 and to accelerate climate ambition. The COP President-designate has met large numbers of governments. He is already out and about visiting many countries, 15 in the last few weeks, and briefing UN member states on a regular basis. And I am working with the most vulnerable countries to make sure that they are supported for their ambitions to meet their resilience challenges.
We have the final question from Hilary Byrne. Hilary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Converting UK homes to zero carbon heating will be a huge task. Does the COP President believe that heat pumps can adequately replace all gas boilers? And if there's a need for supplementary heating, what form does he think this should take?
Mr. Speaker, I refer the right honourable gentleman to the 10-point plan, which set out very clearly the progress that we want to make in terms of decarbonising buildings and homes as well. And of course, heat pumps will play a part. We've also set out in there our plans in terms of the use of hydrogen for home heating as well.
We now come to questions to the Prime Minister. And we start with Gagan Mahendra. Gagan.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I know colleagues across the House will wish to join me in paying tribute to our dear friend and colleague, Dame Cheryl Gillan, who sadly died last week. An MP for Chesham and Amersham for 29 years, she will be remembered for being a strong voice for her constituents, a brilliant campaigner, including her advocacy for autistic people and their families, and for being the first female Secretary of State for Wales. I also want to pay tribute to Baroness Shirley Williams, a pioneer for women in politics and in government, and to our former colleague Peter Ainsworth, who was passionate about his causes, especially the environment. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dame Cheryl represented her constituents with considerable effectiveness for nearly 29 years and is already sorely missed in this place, especially by many of the newer members, as she was so kind to us in our first months in this place. One of her passions was the protection of chalk streams, in particular the River Chess, which passes through my constituency of South West Hertfordshire. Many MPs are increasingly concerned about reports of partially treated sewage being released into our rivers, with knock-on health impacts for both humans and animals. Can my right honourable friend reassure this House that this government will actively protect our rivers and streams?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is entirely right to raise the concern that we fully share about sewage overflow from into rivers such as the Chess, and that's why we have set up the Storm Overflows Task Force to address the matter, working with the water industry regulators and environmental groups. And last month we announced legislation, plans for legislation to address this very issue.
Now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in his remarks about Dame Cheryl Gillen, who I work with on a cross-party basis and remember with fondness, and Ian Gibson, who also passed away this week. Both commanded respect on all sides of this House and will be sadly missed. Can I also pay tribute to Shirley Williams? She was a great parliamentarian, a formidable minister and cabinet minister. She loved this House, the other place, and frankly anywhere where she could debate ideas and politics. For many years she was Labour's loss. Today she is Britain's loss, and my thoughts are with her family and loved ones. Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister believe that the current lobbying rules are fit for purpose?
Mr. Speaker, I join the right honourable gentleman in what he said about Ian Gibson, and I indeed share the widespread concern about some of the stuff that we're reading at the moment, Mr. Speaker, and I know that the Cabinet Secretary shares my concern as well. I do think it is a good idea in principle that top civil servants should be able to engage with business and should have experience of the private sector. When I look at the accounts I'm reading today, it's not clear that those boundaries have been properly understood, and I've asked for a proper independent review of the arrangements that we have to be conducted by Nigel Boardman, and he will be reporting in June, and if he has any representations he wishes to make on that subject, he should do so to Mr. Boardman.
Stop.
Mr. Speaker, I know the Prime Minister is launching an inquiry. That inquiry isn't even looking at the lobbying rules. I'm not sure it's looking at very much at all, because every day there's further evidence of the sleaze that's now at the heart of this Conservative government. Let's just look, shake your heads, let's just look at the latest scandal. A wealthy businessman, Lex Greensill, was hired as a senior advisor to David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. We've all seen the business card. After he left office, Cameron, became a paid lobbyist for Lex Greensill. Next thing we know, Cameron arranged access for Greensill with cabinet ministers and senior officials, and he lobbied for taxpayers' money on behalf of Greensill Capital. We also know the Chancellor pushed officials. We know the Health Secretary met Cameron and Greensill. We know that senior officials met Greensill Capital regularly. And now, even more unbelievably, we know the government's former head of procurement, no less, became a Greensill advisor while he was still a civil servant. Does the Prime Minister accept there's a revolving door, indeed an open door, between his Conservative government and paid lobbyists?
Mr. Speaker, this is a government and a party that has been consistently tough on lobbying, and indeed we introduced legislation saying that there should be no taxpayer-funded lobbying, that quangos should not be used to get involved with lobbying. We put in a register for lobbyists, and there's one party, Mr. Speaker, that actually voted to repeal the 2014 Lobbying Act, and that was the Labour Party in their historic 2019 election manifesto, which he is yet to repudiate, Mr. Speaker. They did so because they thought it was unfair and was restricting people's ability to make representations to politicians. I think that's absurd. Will he now say that it's absurd to repeal the 2014 Lobbying Act?
Mr. Speaker, he talks of the Lobbying Act. Who was it who introduced that legislation? David Cameron. Who was it who voted for the legislation? Half the Conservative front bench. We said it wouldn't be tough enough. And where did that legislation lead? 2 years later, David Cameron camping out in a Saudi desert with Lex Greensill having a cup of tea. I rest my case in relation to that legislation. Let me try another very simple question. Is the Prime Minister aware of any other government official who had commercial links with Greensill or any other lobbying role while working in government?
Mr. Speaker, if he has any such information, he should, of course, make it available to Mr. Boardman. That's the point of his. That's the point of his review. It's an independent review. It'll be coming to me by June. I'll be glad it will be played in the library of the House of Commons. I talk about lobbying, Mr. Speaker. He's being advised by Lord Mandelson of Global Counsel Limited. Perhaps in the interests of full transparency, so we can know where he's coming from, Lord Mandelson could be encouraged to disclose his other clients, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I haven't heard a defence that ridiculous since my last days in the Crown Court. It's called the shoplifter's defence. Everyone else is nicking stuff, so why can't I? Mr. Speaker, it never worked. I remind the Prime Minister I not only prosecuted shoplifters, I prosecuted MPs over the MPs' expenses scandal, so I stand on my record. That line just isn't going to wash with me. It was a former Prime Minister, and I suspect now a former lobbyist, who once said, "This isn't a minor issue with minor consequences. Government contracts potentially worth hundreds of billions of pounds are at stake." So can the Prime Minister now answer the question the Chancellor's been ducking for weeks? How was it that Greensill Capital, a company employing David Cameron, got the green light to give hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayer-backed loans?
Mr. Speaker, whilst he was prosecuting MPs, I was cutting crime in London by 23% and cutting the murder rate by 50%. And he asks about lobbying on behalf of Greensill. Mr. Speaker, and again, I don't wish to embarrass the right honourable gentleman, but he doesn't have far to look. There was one person asking for the Greensill Bank to be able to use the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, and that was the Shadow Defence Secretary, Mr. Speaker.
This gets weaker and weaker. It does take me back to my defence days in the Crown Court. It's just ridiculous. The Shadow Defence Secretary. It really wasn't a good point. If you think that's a good point, you've got real problems. Shadow Defence Secretary was speaking for his constituents and for local jobs. That is million miles away from being a paid lobbyist texting friends in government. The Prime Minister says there's going to be an inquiry, but the person he's appointed worked for the same law firm which lobbied to loosen lobbying laws. You couldn't make it up. What we need is to overhaul the whole broken system. This afternoon, Labour's motion calls for a proper parliamentary inquiry into this scandal. If the Prime Minister is so concerned about this, he should welcome the motion. After all, to quote David Cameron, his old school friend, sunlight is the best disinfectant. So will the Prime Minister vote with Labour today for a full, transparent, independent inquiry?
Mr. Speaker, I think he would have been better off supporting the Lobbying Act, and the Labour Party would have been better off not campaigning to get rid of it. It toughens up our laws, and Mr. Speaker, I think that his own proposal is simply to have, yet again, to have politicians marking their own homework. What the country wants, that's all it is. A committee of MPs to look at it. It won't do a blind bit of good. That's why we're having a proper independent review. If he has any representations or allegations to make about what has taken place, he should make them to the eminent lawyer who's been asked to do it, who'll be reporting to us by June.
Yes, Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister should be voting with us, not blocking a proper inquiry. The Greensill scandal is just the tip of the iceberg. Dodgy contracts, privileged access, jobs for their mates. This is the return of Tory sleaze. Mr. Speaker, It's now so ingrained in this Conservative government, we don't need another Conservative Party appointee marking their own homework. Actually, Mr Speaker, the more I listen to the Prime Minister, the more I think that Ted Hastings and AC12 are needed to get to the bottom of this one. Mr Speaker, we know the Prime Minister will not act against sleaze, but this House can. So can I urge all members of this House to come together this afternoon to back Labour's motion and start to clean up the sleaze and cronyism that's at the heart of this Conservative government?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, that's why we're putting in an independent review. That's why we have tougher laws on lobbying. A great shame that Labour opposed them. Mr Speaker, yes, we are getting on with rooting out bent coppers, Mr Speaker. We're also appointing and hiring thousands more police officers. Mr Speaker, we're fighting crime. We're fighting crime on the streets of our cities, whilst they opposed the police and crime bill, which would have put in tougher sentences for serious sexual and violent offenders. Absolutely. And they then encouraged people who went out and demonstrated, Mr Speaker, to kill the bill. We're getting on with protecting the public. That's absolutely correct, Mr Speaker. We're getting on with protecting the public of this country from crime of all kinds. We're getting on with the job of running this country, of rolling out a vaccination programme.
Order. Prime Minister, I think we ought to at least try and address the question. Dean Russell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's been a year this week since I had the privilege of starting to volunteer at Watford General Hospital, and over this time I've been fortunate and privileged to work along some inspirational and selfless volunteers. So as the nation reflects this week on the importance of schemes to support young people, may I ask the Prime Minister if he would meet with me to explore the creation of an NHS cadet scheme to pay tribute to those who've already volunteered over the past year and also create a lasting legacy for generations to come. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. I thank you. I thank my honourable friend for what he's doing. I thank everybody at Watford General Hospital for the support they've given throughout the pandemic, and particularly, Mr Speaker, the volunteers who play a massive part in our vaccination rollout programme. And I fully support the NHS cadet scheme, part of our work to establish a volunteering legacy for young people from the pandemic.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Morning time, Mr Speaker. Can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition on Dame Cheryl Gillan and of Shirley Williams? Mr Speaker, the Scottish Government has passed landmark legislation embedding the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scots law. A real revolution in children's rights. Every party in the Scottish Parliament supported it, even the Scots Tories. It has been welcomed everywhere, except here in Westminster. Instead of supporting this new law, the UK government is shamefully taking the Scottish Parliament to court in order to strike it down. Apparently, the only basis of the UK government's legal case is that the law constrains Westminster powers. So, Prime Minister, can you do everyone a favour by explaining how protecting children's rights in Scotland threatens the Tory government in London?
Mr Speaker, this is complete nonsense. The government of the United Kingdom ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child 30 years ago. We all support it. It is nothing to do with the rights of vulnerable children, which we all protect. This is simply an attempt by the SNP to stir up constitutional chaos and create another fictitious bone of contention between themselves and the rest of the country. If they really cared about the rights of the child, Mr Speaker, they would do much more to improve education in Scotland, where they are so lamentably failing, Mr Speaker.
Ian Blackford.
The rights of the child, an act passed by the Scottish Parliament, supported by every party, and his government is taking our Parliament, our government, to court. Mr Speaker, there's nothing technical about this, and the Westminster government wants to strip away the rights of children in Scotland. This is a tale of two governments. We have an SNP Scottish government delivering the baby box, doubling the Scottish child payment and providing free school meals to every primary school child. At the same time, this Tory government is robbing children of their rights in Scotland. Quite simply, Mr Speaker, the SNP Scottish government has and will continue to work to ensure Scotland is the best place for a child to grow up. This legal challenge threatens that. It is wrong and it is morally repugnant, Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister commit to withdrawing his legal challenge today? If not, we'll see you in court.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the best thing they can do, as I say, for the rights of the child in Scotland is to improve their shameful record on education and to tackle the issues that matter to the people of Scotland, to tackle the tax regime that they put in place, to do better on fighting crime and drug addiction in Scotland. They should be looking at the issues that really matter, in my view, to the people of Scotland. And instead, they're going into the elections next month, Mr. Speaker, yet again on a campaign to break up this country. That's all they can think of. Break up this country, call for a referendum, break up this country, destroy our country, and call a referendum in a way that I think is completely irresponsible at a very difficult time when we want to bounce back stronger together.
David Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The A55 expressway is of huge importance to North Wales, linking the region to the main motorway network. It is also, as was noted in the recent interim report on the Union Connectivity Review, the principal freight artery for the port of Holyhead. The road is in desperate need of improvement and has been for many years. So will my right honourable friend confirm that the government will make it a priority to use its powers under the UK Internal Market Act to upgrade the road for the benefit of the people of North Wales?
Thank you. I thank my right honourable friend. He's completely right, and Sir Peter Hendy has rightly identified the potential of the A55, and I think the best thing the people of Wales can do to guarantee these vital upgrades is to elect a Welsh Conservative government on May the 6th.
We now go to Vicky Foxcroft. Vicky, I understand you're going to sign. Can you speak and sign at the same time for all our benefits? Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if the Prime Minister doesn't understand, imagine how those who rely on British Sign Language feel at his press briefings. 2.6 million spent on the new press room, yet still no interpreter. What message does he think this sends to disabled people?
I'm grateful to the honourable lady and grateful for the way she has set out her question. I will revert to her as soon as I can.
Sarah Dines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that it is thanks to the sacrifice of the British people during lockdown and the great success of the vaccination programme that lots of small businesses across the whole country and in my constituency in Derbyshire Dales, like Brocklehurst, who supplied clothing to the Duke of Prince Philip, that they can remain open? Will he join with me in a campaign to shop local as we come out of lockdown?
I thank my honourable friend, and I can tell her that, yes, I certainly will encourage her and everybody else to shop local as we come out of lockdown, and as I very much hope that we will be able to do. And my right honourable friend, the Communities Secretary, has announced £830 million of funding from the Future High Streets Fund has been allocated to areas, including her own, in order to encourage that shopping that we all hope and want to see.
Ruth Catherine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I extend my condolences and those of my constituents to the Queen and to the royal family for their sad loss, and also to the families and colleagues of Cheryl Gillam and Shirley Williams. Will the Prime Minister tell this House when he last spoke to former Prime Minister David Cameron?
The honest truth, I cannot remember when I last spoke to Dave, but I can, if she wants to know whether I've had any contact with him about any of the matters that have been in the press, the answer is no.
Father of the House, St Peter Bottom.
Mr. Speaker, those who helped to develop, to test, to approve and manufacture the vaccines deserve our praise. Will my right honourable friend also recognise that the successful rollout of the vaccination programme has been based on the dedication of the NHS staff and the myriads of volunteers who made the process so easy for so many people?
My right honourable friend is completely right. This has been a colossal team effort. It has been led by the NHS with GPs very often doing the lion's share of the work, but they've been supported by the Army, by local council officials who have also been absolutely magnificent, and as colleagues have said earlier, by volunteers as well.
16 withdrawn, so we go to Dr. James Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The interim findings of Sir Peter Hendy's Union Connectivity Review are very much to be welcomed. He highlights the improvements that need to be made to the railways in North Wales linking up with Merseyside and Manchester, as well as the A55. These, of course, can help to level up the region. Will my right honourable friend confirm that the identified projects within Sir Peter Hendy's work in North Wales will receive a fair chunk of the £20 million of development funding as part of the agenda? And will he commit to implementing the findings of Sir Peter Hendy's final report when it's released in the summer?
I thank my honourable friend. We will look at what Sir Peter has to say. I think he's come up with some very interesting interim proposals, particularly about improving connectivity along the North Wales coastline, the routes into Merseyside, and on the A55. I repeat what I said to my right honourable friend earlier on. There is a great opportunity to do that if people will vote Conservative and vote for a Welsh Conservative government on May the 6th, Mr. Speaker.
Let's go to Howell Williams. Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2007, my friend Adam Price, then the member for Carmarthen East and Dynevor, proposed an elected representatives prohibition of deception bill. At this distance in time, it would be, well, unkind to quiz the Prime Minister on the detail, because he is seen as a big thinker. So today, perhaps he could tell the House what he thinks of the principle of that bill, which is that on important matters of public policy, politicians must not lie.
Well, I certainly agree. I have a high regard for the honourable gentleman, and indeed, I remember happy times with his colleague Adam Price. I don't remember the details of his bill, but I think, Mr. Speaker, we will all concur with the basic principle that he's just enunciated.
Esther Backday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Former Police Inspector Kash Singh set up One Britain, One Nation, otherwise known as OBON, to bring together all communities, all classes, all ethnicities, races and religions to celebrate being British. OBON Day is held in June. However, next week, on April the 22nd, will be the launch of it at a school in Bradford. Will the Prime Minister join me in congratulating Kash Singh for his fantastic initiative for all communities to come together in a common pride of being British? And will he also make a message for the launch next week?
When I say yes, I'll do my best, Mr. Speaker. But I fully support what she's doing, and I congratulate Kash Singh on his work. And it is incredible at this time, Mr. Speaker. There are people who want to split our country up rather than bring us together. That's what they want to do. I think it's an absolute tragedy that they still think like that. I think they're going to change, Mr. Speaker. But I wish everybody at OBON all the very best.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And contrary to the conclusions of the Race and Ethnic Disparity Report, institutional racism still exists. And 40 years since the Liverpool 8 uprisings, black communities continue to suffer racial injustice. And the report downplays the structural inequalities that still exist. The Resolution Foundation announced today that unemployment rate for young black people rose by 35% compared to 13% for their white counterparts. Can the Prime Minister confirm the allegations that Downing Street redrafted the report to change the narrative, and does he agree with me that this report should now be withdrawn? Thank you.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady, but actually, when you look at the report and read it in detail, there's not everything that this government is going to agree with. Of course not. There is some interesting observations, some interesting ways of looking at things, and we will be responding in due course. But what we say is that nobody should be in any doubt as to the reality of racism, to the reality of the struggle that too many people face, and we are going to do everything we can to stamp it out, and particularly to help young black people get the jobs, get the education that they need.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend will know, as we build back better, we need to inspire the next generation of scientists and engineers. Will he therefore agree to work with Engineering UK and Big Bang Digital to provide a short online introduction to this year's event to reinforce the message that a career in engineering is rewarding, it's creative and can transform the world around us for the better? And will he recognise the extraordinary contribution engineers have made and are making in our battle against COVID?
I thank my friend, because engineers have obviously been crucial, and scientists of all kind, in the fight against COVID. And this is the moment, Mr. Speaker, to become an engineer, or to work towards being an engineer. We're putting a huge £640 billion investment into the infrastructure of this country over the next few years. We're going to need skilled young people to be going into engineering. That's why we put in the T-levels. I congratulate my honourable friend on his initiative. I will do my best to support him.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given his ancestry, the Prime Minister will be more than familiar with the phrase, "a fish rots from the head down." It is a Turkish proverb. Put simply, since he became the Prime Minister, the sound of Big Ben's bungs has been replaced by the cash-till sound of big donor bungs. There's been a threefold increase in bungs from property developers. Last summer, we had the case of Richard Desmond and the Community Secretary. More recently, we've had ministers dishing the dosh between constituencies, and the Health Secretary handing or involved in a contract with his pub landlord for £30 million worth of PPE. Now we have a Chancellor and Health Secretary that have sought to grease the wheels of involvement with Greensill and David Cameron. What does this say about the Prime Minister's leadership of his government?
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid he is simply wrong in what he says, and particularly about what he says about the Chancellor, my friend the Chancellor, and the Health Secretary. And I don't believe that he should have spoken in those terms, Mr. Speaker. But what I will say is that there is one party in this place that brought in tough rules on lobbying, and there's another party that campaigned at the last election to get rid of those rules because of their relationship with the trades unions, Mr. Speaker, because they wanted them to continue in the obscure, opaque way that they were being run, and because they wanted people to be able to continue to lobby parliamentarians in the way that they always did. And look at their Labour manifesto of 2019, Mr. Speaker. If he repudiates it now, why don't go ahead and do so?
Final question from Gareth Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the last few months, a number of my constituents have taken to the streets to help tackle the problem of littering, and I pay particular tribute to those constituents in Colsterworth who I met with recently. Will the Prime Minister join me in backing the Grantham Journal's Spring Clean campaign, and can he assure my constituents the government are doing all it can to help tackle littering?
Prime Minister.
I share, Mr. Speaker, his indignation about litter, and I do think it's one of the things on which the whole of the country, and I hope the whole of the House, is united. That's why we're doing the Respect the Outdoors campaign to encourage people to follow the countryside code, to pick up their litter. Obviously, a lot of people are meeting outdoors at the moment, Mr. Speaker, because of the pandemic. They must obey the basic laws of respect for other people, pick up their litter. We're putting money into new litter bins, and yes, Mr. Speaker, we are increasing fines on the spot, fines for littering. I know that there will be many libertarians in this place who think that's unfair and draconian. Personally, Mr. Speaker, I think it's the right thing to do. I abhor litter, and I urge anybody who sees anybody throwing away a crisp packet to tick them off and tell them to pick it up, Mr. Speaker.
I am now suspending the House for 3 minutes to enable necessary arrangements to be made for the next business order. We now come to the 10-minute rule motion. Caroline Harris.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to require the Secretary of State to lay before Parliament a report on proposal to award NHS staff a pay rise for 2021-2022 below 2.1%. To require the Secretary of State to move a House of Commons motion to approve any such report and for connected purposes. The last 13 months have impacted all of our lives. Illness, bereavement and financial worries, on top of learning to live with the fear of the pandemic and the limits on our freedoms. We haven't all faced the same level of difficulties, but none of us have escaped without our lives in some way being changed by the experience. 127,000 people have tragically lost their lives, one of the highest death tolls in Europe. And in the past year, over 450,000 have been hospitalised due to severe COVID symptoms. For every one of those people, it has been our amazing NHS frontline staff that have cared for them, fought for them, and either celebrated their recovery or held their hands as they took their last breath. Our NHS staff have kept this country going, risking their own health, isolating from their own families, working harder than ever, grieving the lives that they couldn't save and comforting the bereaved. They are the very best of Britain, and they deserve to be given the credit and the reward for everything that they have done and everything they have sacrificed to keep the rest of us safe. Nurses and NHS staff were promised at least a 2.1% pay rise, but the government has now retracted that and recommended 1% for all NHS staff, with the exception of junior doctors, GPs and dentists. The government pretend this is a rise. They're fooling no one. With inflation forecast to reach 1.7% this year, our NHS staff will have shown nothing but commitment this last year, are now set to receive a real-term pay cut. Nurses' pay have been falling in real terms since the Conservatives came to power 11 years ago, with pay awards consistently lagging behind inflation. Already this is unacceptable, but in the current situation, the government's proposal to reduce this even further shows a complete lack of respect and gratitude. For me, the thought of looking a nurse in the eye and telling them that they are worth less this year than they were before the pandemic is outrageously insulting. All of us across this House stood on our doorsteps and clapped for key workers. We all took to social media and thanked NHS staff and tell them what a wonderful job they were doing. We would all have been indebted to them if we got sick and needed hospital care against this undiscriminating virus. In fact, some on these benches did. So it was just for show? Were the worm wards and platitudes just a tick box exercise? Or does the Prime Minister and his government, hand on heart, truly believe a rule-breaking, unapologetic aid is worth considerably more than the hundreds of thousands of NHS staff who have worked tirelessly and selflessly to battle this viral enemy and save lives? That promise was clear. 2.1% increase as a minimum, not dependent on inflation rates or any other economic struggles. And that promise has been broken in yet another ill-judged U-turn by the government. If the Prime Minister and his Cabinet colleagues have now rescinded that offer and replaced it with an inferior one, then they need to come to this House with a revised recommendation and put it to a vote. When members on this side of the House clapped on a Thursday evening and pledged our support to the NHS heroes, we meant it, and we still mean it. They have held up their side of the bargain, working diligently and doing everything in their power to save lives. Now it's our turn to hold up ours by voting in favour of a fair, long-term pay deal that reflects their commitment. A recent survey by the Royal College of Nurses concluded that more than a third of the 42,000 who submitted responses were considering leaving the NHS because they felt undervalued. These are staff who are exhausted from their efforts over the last year. They've worked unpaid overtime. They've forfeited their own mental well-being, and they far too often put our families ahead of their own. The least they expected in return was recognition and fairness. But for a government that has consistently failed to deliver on both, it appears that they were expecting too much. We're on a cliff edge here. We know already that we entered the pandemic with a record 100,000 vacancies across the NHS. If we don't pay the staff what they deserve, then we will struggle to retain those that we have, let alone fill any vacancies. Even the 2.1 in the long-term plan was a minimum, and a cautious one at that. 1% is not a pay rise, it's an insult. Trade unions and professional bodies are calling for improved pay offers at varying levels. They know a fair pay rise would also help boost staff recruitment and retention. A 1% pay rise for an experienced nurse equates to £3.50 a week. £3.50 for a year of unpaid overtime, unwavering commitment and personal sacrifice. £3.50 for a year of turmoil, of fighting a virus that at times seemed unbeatable, of watching patients die despite doing everything they could to save them, of having to keep on going when they were beyond exhausted. On this side of the House, we believe our NHS are worth so much more. With this bill, the government will be required to present their recommendations for anything below the already proved minimum increase of 2.1 and seek agreement from the House of any new proposals. That is the least our NHS deserves. Our NHS staff have not faltered since the start of the pandemic, and they deserve to be rewarded for that. Unions and stakeholders know it. The public know it. And we on this side of the House know it. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
That the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no.
No! 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 No!
I think we're now getting a bit more to it. Right, let's lock the doors. Division. The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no.
No, no.
Tellers for the ayes, Colleen Fletcher and Jill Furness. For the noes, Mark Tommy and Jessica Morden. Lock the doors! Order. The ayes... Oops, sorry.
Ayes to the right, 222. The noes to the left, 0.
The ayes to the right, 222. The noes to the left, 0. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. And lock. Who will prepare to bring in the bill?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner, Jonathan Ashworth, Dr Rosanna Allen-Khan, Mr Nicholas Brown, Liz Kendall, Justin Madders, Alex Norris, Jim Shannon, Jamie Stone and myself, Mr Speaker.
Harris.
NHS Pay Award Report Bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Thank you. We now come to the first Opposition Day motion on committee to investigate the lobbying of government. I call Rachel Reeves to move the motion. Shadow Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The lunches, the hospitality, the quiet word in your ear, the ex-ministers and ex-advisers for sale, helping business find the right way to get its way. This is how former Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron described the next big scandal to hit British politics. That was back in 2010. You might think that what David Cameron lacks in transparency, he makes up for in fortune-telling. Except that he had inside information, because the person exploiting the loopholes would be the very same David Cameron. We have a Conservative Prime Minister giving Lex Greensill access to all areas of government. He was brought in and given privileged access to the heart of government with the title and the business card as a senior advisor in the Prime Minister's office. And then, what a stroke of luck. When he was no longer Prime Minister, and just past the period where he no longer needed approval of the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, David Cameron joins Greensill to lobby the Conservative government full of his friends. Having refused to respond to any questions at all for 40 days, David Cameron chose a period of national grief, hoping that there would be less political criticism and less scrutiny. Mr Speaker, it is cynical and it is shabby. And the statement itself, it was toe-curling. He's not sorry for his conduct, for the texts and the drinks, but he is sorry he got caught, and he's sorry that his shares are now worthless. This isn't just a question of why he didn't go through the correct channels, but it's a question of why he was doing this at all. So let's be really clear. David Cameron was not working in the national interest, but in his own personal interest, with the hope of making millions of pounds for himself through the exercise of his share options. But questions cannot just be asked of David Cameron, when it is current Conservative ministers who have paved the way for this scandal. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to lobbying, it takes two to tango. For every former minister lobbying, there is someone in power being lobbied. And this is why this scandal isn't just about the conduct of David Cameron during his time as Prime Minister and in the years afterwards. This is about who he lobbied in the current government and how they responded. Lex Greensill was awarded a CBE and made a Crown representative by a Conservative government. Yet his company's spectacular collapse now means over 50,000 jobs are at risk around the world, including thousands in UK's steel communities. From Hartlepool to Stocksbridge, from Rotherham to Scunthorpe and to Newport, the steel industry is crucial, and the government must make clear that our steel industry will not pay the price for the failures at Greensill and beyond. This government have set up an inquiry, but just about supply chain finance and Greensill. Such a review is wholly inadequate, and deliberately so. They don't want to explore what needs to change in lobbying, or who currently gets access to power, or the wider issue of how to lift the lid, lift standards which have fallen so far in the 10 years of Conservative governments. Mr. Speaker, they don't want public hearings. They don't want the disinfectant of sunlight, as David Cameron once urged. They just want this to go away, which is why they have chosen Nigel Boardman to chair the inquiry. It is a fact that Nigel Boardman is a good friend, a very good friend of the Conservative government. Now, some may suspect that the son of a former Conservative cabinet minister might be unlikely to make waves. But let's look at his own record. Mr. Boardman has been paid over £20,000 per year as a non-executive director at the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, a department with a real interest in the British Business Bank, which lent to Greensill, and the British steel industry, where so many jobs are now at risk. Mr. Boardman has already whitewashed the government's handling of public procurement during the pandemic, and I fear that he will do the same again with this inquiry. Mr. Speaker, you will remember that I jointly chaired the inquiry into the collapse of Carillion. The fact that Mr. Boardman's law firm made £8 million advising Carillion, including £1 million on the day before the outsourcer's collapse, it leaves a terrible taste in my mouth, and it should do in the mouths of members opposite. And to cap it all off, Mr. Boardman was appointed to a prestigious role at the British Museum by David Cameron. What is being proposed by the government is not remotely fit for purpose. It's not an inquiry, it's not independent, it's an insult to us all. Mr. Speaker, the scope of this inquiry has got to be bigger than supply chain financing. It's got to be about lobbying too, and bigger than what rules were broken. If the existing lobbying rules were not breached, then that is a big part of the problem, surely. Had the Conservatives backed Labour's amendments to the lobbying bill back in 2014, then there would have been much more transparency. But they didn't. David Cameron and his government voted them down. And boy, are they exploiting them now. We need public service in the national interest, not viewing the state like some get-rich-quick scheme with taxpayers treated as collateral damage. Now, we learn that the Conservatives are joined by the SNP in all of this, whose Rural Economy Secretary in the Scottish Government dined with Lex Greensill in one of Glasgow's finest restaurants with no officials, no notes, no emails, no texts, no phone records about the meeting. And here in Westminster, we have witnessed the degrading of the ministerial code. I'll happily take a point.
As the Minister, and at the moment we have absolutely no quibble with what the Shadow Minister is saying, but is she trying to draw an equivalence between what David Cameron did and what Fergus Ewing did in a meeting which was recorded and is publicly available and has been for a long, long time on the Scottish Government's own website?
there was nothing untoward with what Fergus Ewing did. And to try and to conflate both, I think the lady does a great disservice to herself and her argument.
Well, the Scottish people can be the judge of that. And if you think that a Scottish minister dining with Lex Greensill is okay, then put that on your leaflets in the elections in May. Sir Alex Allen, you'll remember, Mr. Speaker, he resigned as an independent advisor on ministerial interests following the Prime Minister's failure to take action on the Home Secretary's bullying behaviour. Mr. Speaker, that was 5 months ago now. This government haven't replaced him. They haven't even advertised the job. What does that say about how seriously this government takes standards? I'll very happily give way to the right honourable gentleman.
I'd just point out that when Gordon Brown appointed his Prime Minister's advisor on ministerial interests, that job wasn't advertised either, because it isn't advertised. It's a Prime Ministerial appointment. But can I just ask, her motion is proposing to set up a new select committee when there are many existing select committees, and I am chairman of the liaison committee. Why hasn't she consulted any of us about this manoeuvre? I appreciate what oppositions do, which is to try and embarrass the government, but she's right that there are much wider issues to address, and shouldn't we try and address these issues in a bipartisan manner?
Thank you to the honourable gentleman for the intervention. On the point of Sir Alex Allen, the point is that we're 5 months later and nobody has been appointed to this role. Whether we advertise the role or not, the point is it's been vacant for 5 months. The honourable gentleman says from a sedentary position, I think, that it will happen shortly. Well, 5 months is an awful long time. I'm going to come on to the issue of the composition of the Select Committee. But like the right honourable gentleman, I had the privilege of chairing a Select Committee. And when scandals happen, we looked into them, as we did with the collapse of Carillion. I know the right honourable gentleman did so himself. But the problem is there is no overarching inquiry planned into what happened, not just with Greensill, but more widely around lobbying and cronyism and sleaze. And I'm very happy to work on a cross-party basis to take this forward, and I welcome the comments from the right honourable gentleman himself over the last couple of days. As well as the lack of an advisor on ministerial interests, there has been an absence of ministerial interests being published. They were supposed to be published twice a year, but they were published only once last year in July, and not at all since then. Now, Mr. Speaker, these things matter. They are about the foundations on which the standards of government rest. And under this government, those foundations are being consciously removed. And that is why this motion today does what the government should have done, but chose not to. It gives the power to this House, not the government, with a 16-strong select committee with clout to investigate this whole sorry scandal. It would have powers to call witnesses and examine them in public, like an effective select committee would. The scope of the investigation that we propose would look at inappropriate lobbying of government and what needs to be done to change and prevent it. It would have the powers needed to demand witnesses and communications. It would examine the advisory committee on business appointments and whether they have the sufficient powers, resources and the right remit. Put simply, this special new select committee would aim to tackle the problem staring us in the face, not to cover it up. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I note and thank her for her motion. I just wondered why she thought it was appropriate that the membership of that committee be nominated by the Committee of Selection. Why should it be filled with a load of whip stooges?
Richard Rees.
I won't comment on how select committee chairs sometimes elected in this place. But look, as a former select committee chair, I know how seriously colleagues around the House would take this responsibility, as the honourable gentleman does. We are prepared to make a concession to honourable members opposite. We will accept that this committee can be chaired by a backbencher from the governing party, as long as there is cross-party representation on the committee, as with other select committees. Now, the Conservative Party, party opposite, are at a fork in the road. If MPs vote for this motion, then a proper investigation can take place, led by a team with the confidence of this House, not someone handpicked from the board of one of the government departments embroiled in this scandal. But if they vote against it, as the Prime Minister has told you all to do, then I am sorry to say that they too will be part of the government's attempt to cover up Tory sleaze. All members here today should reflect on who they are here to serve, their constituents and their country, or narrow party political interests. And the stakes are high for our democracy and our public life. It was a past Conservative government embroiled in sleaze in the 1990s, which eventually recognised the need for standards to rise and to create the Nolan Principles. The Nolan Principles of public life have to live and breathe through all those in public office, serving our great country. Yesterday we learned that the government's former head of procurement was an advisor to Greensill while still a civil servant. And incredibly, that was approved. And the defence is that it was not uncommon. I mean, what on earth was happening at the Cabinet Office and at the heart of government to allow these conflicts of interests to fester? Sir John Major, who witnessed the Cash for Questions scandal and other Tory sleaze in the 90s when he was Prime Minister, also believes that the rules need to be changed again. Now, one of the Nolan Principles, Mr. Speaker, as you well know, is leadership. So with that in mind, where is the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster today? And where was the Chancellor of the Exchequer yesterday? What have they got to hide, Mr. Speaker? There is a wider pattern of behaviour with the Conservatives here, in the present as well as in the recent past. A Conservative government which is more interested in private drinks with the owners of private jets than they are with meeting the families of those bereaved by COVID. A government which gave a 40% pay rise to Dominic Cummings, but a pay cut to nurses. Tory politicians thinking that it's one rule for them and another rule for everybody else. Personal attention lavished on friends of Cameron, while 3 million people are excluded from government financial support and they can't even get a meeting with the Treasury. If the honourable member wants to defend all that, be my guest.
Right Honourable Lady, on the subject of leadership, of course, she's touched on the Scottish government. But the Welsh government, of course, has been in place for 22 years, still has no lobbying register, and recently ACOBA, of course, have taken the former First Minister, the former Labour First Minister, to task over an appointment to GLG. So on leadership, can I draw her on those points?
Well, as far as I'm aware, the First Minister of Wales does not appointed a financier to be his advisor. He hasn't got £30 million worth of share options that he fancies exercising. And the honourable gentleman has abstained in a vote today to give a pay rise to nurses. Well, you know, I'd say put that on your election leaflet at the next general election. Now, £2 billion of public contracts in the last year have gone to friends and donors of the Conservative Party, rolling out the red carpet with a VIP fast lane for contracts. Supposedly independent reports rewritten by Downing Street, undeclared details on who has paid what for a luxury refurbishment of the number 10 Downing Street flat. Relationships undisclosed, increasingly frequent breaches and casual disregard for the ministerial code. Some have asked this week, quite powerfully, when did we stop caring about honesty and integrity? That is what this motion is about. What happens in the vote will say so much about our great country, but also about our current government. That is why I urge all honourable and right honourable members to do the right thing and back this motion today. Vote for a proper investigation, to close the loopholes, to rein in the lobbyists and to lift standards in this great democracy in which we all have the privilege to serve.
The question is, as on the order paper, I am now going to go over to Chloe Smith.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the chance to contribute today to this Opposition Day debate, and I am sure you will appreciate that it is appropriate and possible to do so virtually. Can I first of all add my own tribute to those made earlier this week to His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, whose commitment to the service of this country and to the highest possible standards of conduct was exemplary. Mr. Speaker, during the extraordinary challenge of COVID-19, the government has worked with people and businesses of all sorts, from private citizens to key workers, from our brilliant SMEs to multinationals. And in that monumental effort to protect the public and save lives across the country, civil servants across government, working under incredible pressure, have achieved extraordinary things. And even away from times of crisis, this country can be proud of the standards that we do uphold. In Transparency International's 2020 index, which ranks countries, the United Kingdom was ranked above close European neighbours such as France and Ireland in 11th place. We are the first G20 country to establish a public register of domestic company beneficial ownership and the first G7 country to undergo an IMF fiscal transparency evaluation. Mr. Speaker, this government values such reputation and will always uphold it. And as honourable members heard my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, say just now, we are concerned at some of what has emerged in recent weeks. Most of what this complex motion proposes is already being done. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, as the Policy Minister responsible, it is perfectly sensible for me to respond today on behalf of my department. The Honourable Lady for the Opposition has shadowed me before 10 years ago, and it is good to see her again today in her place. Mr. Speaker, the motion seeks to establish in standing orders a select committee with a remit so wide-ranging as to cut across Parliament's existing committees and independent bodies that have responsibilities in this area. Let's take the elements part by part. Looking at the effectiveness of existing legislation on lobbying, the government is already doing this, and I should explain more in a second. The Greensill affair, an independent review, was announced this week before this motion was laid and will be effective. Transparency measures, the ACOBAR framework, the Cabinet Office is already working to strengthen the former and supporting my noble friend Lord Pickles' reforms to bolster the latter. We are opposing the motion today because it seeks to duplicate the work that is already in the gift of Parliament and its committees, and, as I will set out now, work that is already being undertaken by the government. Starting with the effectiveness of existing lobbying legislation, we are currently conducting post-legislative scrutiny of Part 1 of the Transparency of Lobbying, Non-Party Campaigning and Trade Union Administration Act 2014, which for short we all know as the Lobbying Act. It is looking precisely at the scope and effectiveness of that legislation. The Honourable Lady did not mention this one whit. That legislation introduced a new statutory register of consultant lobbyists and a requirement that those undertaking paid lobbying on behalf of any third party must register and make clear who they are representing to ministers and permanent secretaries. The requirement for consultant lobbyists to declare that work complements the system of self-regulation that lobbyists also adhere to through professional codes of conduct, and it makes transparent, otherwise hidden lobbying. It remains an important part of the framework, filling an accountability and transparency gap that existed prior to that point. We think it operates effectively, but as I have said, we are looking at whether there are further improvements that can be made, as is best practice through post-legislative scrutiny. And once that work is complete, we intend to deliver a memorandum to the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, PACAC, for further scrutiny. Would it really be constructive for these work streams to be undertaken in parallel by separate committees, potentially cutting across one another, sowing confusion? We think it would not. Whilst the creation of select committees is of course a matter for the House, Mr. Speaker, there are already relevant committees in Parliament with the powers and capacity to do such work as is proposed. PACAC, and I note that the Honourable Gentleman who is the chair of that committee has already spoken, and indeed the prior chair of that committee has already spoken today. That committee is responsible for the examination of the quality and standards of administration across the government. In this Parliament, it has already undertaken relevant inquiries. Indeed, it's also called the chair of the Committee on the Standards in Public Life to give evidence. With powers provided in its standing orders to send for, with powers as proposed for the new proposed committee to send for persons, papers and records and to report to the House, I question the necessity of an additional committee. Indeed, the additional committee proposed would also cost £250,000. Mr. Speaker, Her Majesty's government has a full framework in place to ensure that public money is spent efficiently and that those who serve as stewards of these public resources act in accordance with the highest standards and in the public interest. The use of public money is overseen by the Treasury and, of course, Parliament. and the use of public position and information is overseen by the Cabinet Office and rightly held to account by Parliament and the public. Furthermore, all those who work across the public sector are expected to maintain the ethical standards embodied in the 7 principles of public life, which underpin the respective codes for ministers, the civil service and special advisors, as well as the code of conduct for board members of public bodies. Now, that requirement to act with integrity means that public office holders must avoid placing themselves under any obligation to people or organisations that might try to inappropriately influence them in their work. And all holders of public office must declare and resolve any interests. We are not complacent, Mr. Speaker, neither about the scale of this challenge nor about taking action where necessary to uphold the public's faith in what we should all stand for. Since 2010, under the coalition and then under Conservative governments, we have significantly increased the transparency on the workings of government, which the public should rightly be able to expect, from publishing contracts and detail of spending, salaries, tenders and meetings, to launching that statutory register of consultant lobbyists. And this is far more than ever published under the last Labour government. This government has banned the once endemic practice of government quangos hiring lobbyists to lobby the government. It has ensured that taxpayer-funded government grants are not then used to lobby the government itself. It has introduced greater transparency of trade unions and campaign finance controls on third parties seeking to lobby in our elections. So when the government is being held up to account, as is right, it is because a tougher regime of transparency has been in place for over a decade and is now the norm. We are going further still to uphold the covenant of trust with the public. I've already touched on the government's review of lobbying legislation. In addition, we are reviewing and improving business appointment rules, and Mr. Speaker, I will return to that in a moment or two. But as the Honourable Lady dwelt upon at some length, the Cabinet Office this week has announced a review on behalf of the Prime Minister into the role in government of Greensill Capital, the finance company that went into administration last month. The review will look at the development and use of supply chain finance associated activities in government, and specifically the role of Greensill, including how contracts were secured and business representatives engaged with government. The review will be wide-ranging and will also consider the issues raised by my noble friend Lord Pickles regarding Mr. Bill Crothers' role at Greensill Capital. And the public can be assured that Mr. Nigel Boardman, the senior lawyer leading the review, who will pause his activities as a non-executive director at the Department for Business for the duration, will have full